In the summer of 1942, Europe was a continent consumed by darkness. Nazi Germany's iron grip stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. Cities like Paris, Warsaw, and Vienna were shadows of their former selves, silenced, watched, controlled. Amid this suffocating occupation, a small, newly formed American intelligence agency prepared to take its first steps into the unknown. It was called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the predecessor of today's CIA. Few outside President Roosevelt's inner circle knew the OSS even existed. Born out of necessity, it was the brainchild of General William Wild Bill Donovan, a decorated World War I hero and an unrelenting believer in unconventional warfare. His mission was simple in theory but impossible in practice: to gather intelligence and sabotage the Axis powers from within occupied Europe. "We will need men of action," Donovan declared. "Men who can fight and think with equal skill." From hidden offices in London, Lisbon, and Algiers, the OSS began recruiting an extraordinary mix of individuals, scholars, linguists, journalists, even Hollywood screenwriters. Training camps sprang up in the English countryside, teaching the arts of espionage, silent killing, coded transmissions, lockpicking, and the cold patience of waiting behind enemy lines. Among the trainees were Americans who had fled Europe, driven by vengeance and loss. Many would never return. Their earliest operations were joint ventures with Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, famously ordered by Churchill to set Europe ablaze. The partnership would become both powerful and perilous. While the British had years of experience in clandestine missions, the Americans were learning by fire, crafting their methods through trial, error, and loss. By late 1942, the first OSS missions were underway. Small teams were parachuted into France, Belgium, and the Netherlands under the cover of night. Their objective: to map German troop movements, identify targets for Allied bombers, and link with local resistance groups. The radios they carried were bulky and fragile. One cracked vacuum tube could mean isolation and death. Yet they transmitted under the constant hum of danger, knowing the Gestapo's direction-finding trucks prowled the streets, triangulating every signal. One such operator, Lieutenant Charles "Chuck" Wilkinson, later described the silence that followed each transmission. "You'd count your breaths. 3 minutes was the limit. Anything longer, and you could hear the trucks starting up somewhere in the distance." Wilkinson's team vanished near Rouen in early 1943. Their fates remain unknown, their final message ending mid-sentence. The OSS learned quickly, and often brutally. In Denmark, an entire cell was betrayed after a radio operator used the same transmission time twice in 1 week. In the Netherlands, a double agent led to the capture of dozens of Allied operatives in what became known as the England Spiel, a devastating counterintelligence success for the Germans. For the OSS, mistakes weren't lessons. They were tombstones. Behind the lines, the agents lived double lives. They forged papers, blended into the population, and trusted only those who had proven their loyalty through blood and loss. Each coded message that reached London carried a cost: a comrade missing, a contact compromised, or a town burned in retaliation. Yet with every setback came progress. The intelligence gathered by these early missions would later guide Allied bombers and inform the strategies of Eisenhower's command. In Washington, Donovan fought constant battles of his own against military skeptics who saw his agency as reckless amateurs. "They don't wear uniforms," one general scoffed. "How can you trust men who fight from the shadows?" Donovan replied, "You trust them because they fight for a world where uniforms won't be needed." As the months passed, OSS operations grew bolder. Parachute drops became more precise. Resistance networks flourished across France, Yugoslavia, and Poland. Cryptographers in London decrypted fragments of messages that hinted at immense German troop movements, fuel depots, and weapons testing sites. Piece by piece, the invisible war took shape. Still, many missions ended in silence. Agents who had names, faces, and stories simply vanished into the fog of war. Some were executed in Gestapo prisons. Others disappeared, crossing borders, or destroyed their radios to avoid capture. The OSS called these black holes, operations swallowed by history itself. Officially, they were unconfirmed losses. Unofficially, they were ghosts. By 1943, the OSS had lost dozens of men and women across occupied Europe, but it had also established one undeniable truth. Intelligence gathered from within the enemy's walls could change the course of the war. Donovan's Shadow Army had proven its worth, and now it was time to strike harder, to prepare for the ultimate test, the invasion of France. As spring approached, the Allies began planning Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious assault in history. To make it succeed, they would need to know exactly what waited on the beaches, troop numbers, fortifications, minefields, and supply routes. It would require precision, courage, and eyes behind enemy lines. That task would fall to the OSS and their British counterparts in what would become one of the most mysterious and costly missions of the war, Operation Sussex. By early 1944, the tide of war had begun to turn. Allied forces had landed in Italy, the Eastern Front was pushing west, and in London, preparations for the invasion of France had reached fever pitch. Every commander, from Eisenhower to Montgomery, knew that success depended on one fragile element: intelligence. Without accurate knowledge of German troop movements, the beaches of Normandy could become a slaughterhouse. And so, a secret operation was born, codenamed Sussex. Operation Sussex was a joint OSS-SWE mission designed to infiltrate occupied northern France months before D-Day. Its objective was clear yet perilous: parachute small, two-person teams into key regions to observe German movements, identify panzer divisions, and monitor road and rail traffic. Their findings would determine where and when Allied forces would land. Yet, to preserve secrecy, these agents were told almost nothing. They would operate alone, cut off from headquarters, with only a shortwave radio, cyanide capsules, and a promise that the Allies would try to bring them home. The Sussex teams trained in the British countryside under relentless conditions. They learned how to parachute by night, how to transmit encrypted signals, and how to blend into occupied life. Each agent carried a small forged identity card, a cover story, and a radio transmitter the size of a typewriter, known as a Type 3 Mark II biscuit. Once on the ground, they had to find food, shelter, and trust in a world where betrayal was common currency. On March 24, 1944, the first Sussex agents boarded their planes, Lockheed Hudsons flown by the Royal Air Force's Special Duties Squadron. They jumped under moonlight into fields near Rouen, Orleans, and Dijon. The drop zones were carefully chosen by the French resistance, who left subtle markers: a lantern hidden behind a haystack, a flickering farmhouse light, or a chalked X on a barn door. In one such drop, Lieutenant Jacques Leroux landed in a field of snow and buried his parachute beneath frozen soil before vanishing into the countryside. His radio crackled to life hours later. Sussex 1, safe. Within weeks, over 60 Sussex agents were scattered across France. Their codenames, Sparrow, Vixen, Condor, and Lynx, became whispers across resistance networks. From villages and abandoned barns, they sent coded messages to London describing every movement they saw: convoys heading north, new fortifications near the Seine, and the arrival of SS troops in Cannes. Each report was analyzed, verified, and fed directly into SHAEF's invasion planning maps. The intelligence was extraordinary. One team near Amiens discovered that the feared 21st Panzer Division had been repositioned farther inland, a detail that influenced Allied deception efforts before D-Day. Another team tracked rail shipments of V-1 rocket components moving toward the Pas-de-Calais. The information saved countless Allied lives, yet every transmission increased the risk of exposure. German radio detection units, known as Funkabwehr, could triangulate a signal's origin in under 20 minutes. To survive, the Sussex agents sent each message in under 3. By May 1944, the losses began to mount. The Condor team operating near Chartres went silent. A week later, villagers reported Gestapo trucks combing the area, seizing anyone suspected of aiding the resistance. Intercepts confirmed that the team's signal had been traced. When Allied forces liberated Chartres months later, they found only the team's buried radio, its dials frozen on the last frequency. The agent's fates remain unknown. In his post-war report, Major Alfred Ulmer of the OSS wrote, "We could not confirm if Condor had been captured or betrayed. The records show their last message cut off mid-transmission. They likely destroyed their codebooks before the enemy reached them." For the OSS, the loss was devastating but not unique. Of the original 120 Sussex agents deployed, nearly one-third never returned. Still, their work paid off. The intelligence collected from Sussex transmissions directly supported the Normandy landings. It provided accurate enemy order of battle data, helping the Allies identify where the German 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, was positioned. This information allowed D-Day planners to adjust drop zones and counter potential armored reinforcements. Though their names were classified, their impact was monumental. Yet the full story of Operation Sussex remained hidden for decades. After the war, many of its records were sealed under British and American secrecy laws. Survivors returned home with no recognition, their missions still officially unconfirmed. Some faded into quiet lives, their wartime identities buried beneath years of silence. Others never stopped wondering what had happened to their comrades who never came back. In a declassified OSS memo dated August 1945, one line stands out. Sussex yielded the most critical intelligence on German deployment prior to Overlord. Many of its operatives are presumed killed, but the value of their work cannot be overstated. Operation Sussex was a triumph of courage wrapped in tragedy, a mission that proved how invisible heroes shaped the fate of nations. Their radios, their code words, and their final transmissions formed the unseen backbone of the Allied invasion. But as France burned and liberation loomed, the OSS looked south. In the mountains of Italy, a new mission was taking shape, one that would push secrecy, sacrifice, and deception to the limit. A mission known as Operation Ginny II. In the icy darkness of March 1944, a small boat slipped away from the coast of Corsica, cutting silently through the Tyrrhenian Sea. On board were 15 men, American commandos of the OSS Maritime Unit, trained for a mission that few expected them to survive. Their destination lay ahead, the Italian Riviera, near La Spezia, a region fortified by the Wehrmacht and patrolled relentlessly by the German Navy. Their objective was simple but suicidal, to destroy a key railway tunnel vital to German troop and supply movements between northern and central Italy. This was Operation Ginny II. The mission's conception came from a desperate need to cripple German logistics. The railway between La Spezia and Genoa carried munitions, fuel, and reinforcements for the Gothic Line, the last major German defensive barrier in Italy. Sabotaging it could stall the enemy's ability to reinforce its northern front. The OSS had attempted a similar mission weeks earlier, Ginny I, but the team never made it ashore, forced back by storms and miscalculations. The men volunteered to try again. Among them was Lieutenant Vincent Russo, a wiry New Yorker known for his calm under pressure, and Ensign Albert Materazzi, an Italian-American linguist who could pass for a local fisherman. Their training had been intense: demolition, night navigation, and coastal infiltration, but their odds were slim. The plan required them to land on a remote beach under the noses of German patrols, hike miles inland, plant explosives, and escape before sunrise. Every minute of delay could mean capture. On the night of March 22, 1944, the commandos boarded two small motor launches disguised as local fishing boats. They carried Sten guns, plastic explosives, and maps drawn from aerial reconnaissance. The sea was calm, the sky clear, ideal conditions, or so it seemed. As they neared the coast, disaster struck. Their navigation compass, damaged by seawater, led them to the wrong landing site, a cove far closer to a German garrison than planned. Still, the men pressed on, rowing ashore in silence. They buried their rafts in the sand, shouldered their gear, and began their climb toward the tunnel. But fate, or misfortune, was waiting. A sentry spotted movement on the shoreline and raised the alarm. Within hours, German patrols swept the area. By midday, the 15 OSS men were surrounded near the village of Ameglia. Outnumbered and outgunned, they surrendered after a brief firefight. Their radios and explosives were confiscated. Captured alive, they were transferred to La Spezia for interrogation. Normally, captured commandos would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. But Hitler's infamous Commando Order, issued in 1942, demanded that any Allied saboteur caught behind German lines be executed immediately, regardless of uniform. The order had already claimed countless lives across Europe. The men of Operation Ginny II were next. On March 26, 1944, after a summary field trial, the 15 Americans were taken to a small clearing near Punta Bianca. One by one, they were lined up against a wall. German soldiers of the 135th Fortress Brigade carried out the executions. The men were buried in shallow graves beneath olive trees. No formal record was made. To the German command, they simply ceased to exist. For months, their disappearance was a mystery. The OSS knew only that contact had been lost. Rumors circulated among the Italian resistance about captured Americans near La Spezia, but confirmation was impossible. It wasn't until after the war, when Allied investigators and Italian villagers uncovered the graves, that the truth emerged. The men's identification tags were still around their necks, evidence of an atrocity committed in defiance of every rule of war. In 1947, the U.S. Army's War Crimes Branch opened an investigation. Interrogations of captured German officers revealed chilling details. General Anton Dossler, commander of the 75th Army Corps, had personally approved the executions, citing Hitler's order. During his trial in Rome, Dossler maintained that he was following direct orders from above. The tribunal rejected the defense. On December 1, 1945, General Dossler was executed by firing squad, one of the first German officers held accountable for enforcing the Commando Order. The legacy of Operation Ginny II is both tragic and instructive. It demonstrated the extremes of risk OSS operatives faced and the moral void of total war. General Donovan later wrote in his report to Washington, "Their mission failed, but their courage never did. They embodied the very essence of what the OSS stood for: to dare, to suffer, to know." In a 1946 debriefing, an OSS officer who had trained the Ginny men recalled, "They were restless. They wanted to make a difference. We told them they were walking into hell, and they smiled." Even decades later, questions lingered. Some historians speculate that a local informer betrayed the team after seeing their unfamiliar uniforms. Others suggest German radio interception played a role, tracing Allied coastal activity from Corsica. The truth remains partly hidden, like the very tunnels the men sought to destroy. Today, near Ameglia, a small stone memorial marks the place where the 15 OSS commandos fell. Locals still lay flowers there on March 26th each year. It is a quiet tribute to those who fought in the shadows and paid the highest price. But as the OSS mourned its losses in Italy, another group of agents prepared for a mission deep inside the Austrian Alps, a mission so improbable, even their own commanders doubted it would succeed. They called it Operation Greenup, the most daring infiltration ever attempted by the OSS. In February 1945, with Nazi Germany collapsing on every front, a handful of OSS agents prepared for one of the most audacious missions of the war. Codenamed Operation Greenup, its objective was to penetrate the heart of the Third Reich, the Tyrolean Alps of Western Austria, and uncover the movements of German troops retreating through the Brenner Pass. It was a mission so dangerous and so unlikely to succeed that even OSS commanders in Bari called it a suicide run with purpose. The operation was the brainchild of OSS officer Friedrich Mayer, a German-born Jew who had fled Nazi persecution before the war. Fluent in multiple languages and driven by vengeance as much as duty, Mayer was the perfect agent to move among the enemy. His team would consist of just two others, Franz Weber, a former Austrian Wehrmacht officer familiar with the region, and Hans Wigenberg, a Dutch-born Jewish radio operator who had lost his family in the Holocaust. Together, They would infiltrate Nazi-occupied Austria disguised as German soldiers and operate entirely on their own. From the very start, GreenUp defied logic. Unlike other OSS missions that relied on local resistance networks or established drop zones, this one demanded total improvisation. Their insertion point lay near Innsbruck, deep inside enemy lines, hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied position. To reach it, they would parachute from a B-24 bomber in the dead of night, land atop a glacier, and make their way down into the valley below. The odds of surviving the jump alone were less than 50%. On the night of February 26, 1945, the bomber took off from Bari, Italy, climbing through freezing clouds over the Alps. The men carried only their false papers, a small radio transmitter, forged Wehrmacht documents, and a few days' rations. When the red light flashed, they jumped, vanishing into a world of snow and silence. Their parachutes disappeared into the blinding white of the Stubai Glacier. Hours later, half-frozen and bruised, they regrouped and began their descent. They sought shelter in a mountain hut belonging to Weber's relatives, who were secretly anti-Nazi. For weeks, the family hid them, feeding them bread and goat's milk, while Mayer established contact with sympathetic locals. By posing as a German engineer inspecting fortifications, Mayer moved freely around Innsbruck, gathering intelligence on troop movements, rail traffic, and the destruction of bridges. His charisma and confidence made him invisible in plain sight. Using Wittenberg's radio, they transmitted detailed reports back to OSS headquarters in Italy. Their messages confirmed what Allied planners had suspected, that the Germans were concentrating their remaining armor and fuel reserves in the Alpine region, preparing for a last stand known as the Alpine Fortress. These reports reached General Mark Clark's headquarters in real time and were instrumental in targeting German supply lines across the Brenner Pass. But the mission's success brought deadly attention. In early March, the Gestapo began tightening its grip on Innsbruck, searching for Allied spies rumored to be operating in the area. The pressure grew unbearable. On one reconnaissance trip, Mayer was captured after a local Nazi sympathizer betrayed him for a bag of sugar. Hauled before the Gestapo, he was beaten for hours, then dragged to the headquarters of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service. The interrogators demanded names, codes, and radio locations. Mayer gave them nothing. A survivor later recounted that Mayer endured 7 straight days of torture without breaking. His jaw was shattered, his hands burned, but when asked for his true identity, he smirked and said, "I am an American officer, and soon you'll be my prisoner." The interrogators laughed until the sound of distant artillery began to echo through the valleys. The Americans were closer than anyone realized. In a twist of fate, the Gestapo officer who had ordered Mayer's interrogation was captured by Austrian partisans. With German command disintegrating, chaos spread across the region. On May 3, 1945, just days before Germany's official surrender, Mayer was freed. He immediately negotiated with the local Gestapo commander, convincing him to surrender Innsbruck to advancing American forces, sparing the city from destruction. The OSS called it a miracle of nerve and luck. In the final mission report, Donovan's office wrote, "GreenUp stands as one of the most successful small-team operations ever executed behind enemy lines." The intelligence Mayer and his team provided had exposed the last vestiges of Nazi resistance and confirmed that the so-called Alpine Fortress was little more than a myth. After the war, Mayer, Weber, and Wittenberg quietly returned to civilian life. Their story remained classified for decades, overshadowed by larger battles and better-known heroes. Only in the 1990s did the full details of Operation GreenUp emerge, a testament to courage, defiance, and the strange power of 3 men who changed the course of a collapsing empire. The Alpine winds that once carried their secret transmissions now whisper through valleys where the war once raged. Their mission, long hidden, revealed the fragility of the Third Reich's final days and the strength of those who fought it from within. But even as the OSS celebrated its Alpine triumph, another story unfolded hundreds of miles to the east, one not of sabotage, but salvation. In the skies over Yugoslavia, Hundreds of downed airmen awaited rescue. It would become the largest secret airlift of the war, known simply as Operation Halyard. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Yugoslavia were a graveyard of Allied aircraft. American B-24 Liberators, returning from bombing runs against the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, often limped home through Axis-occupied territory, only to be ripped apart by flak or German fighters. Hundreds of airmen bailed out over the rugged Serbian mountains, where capture by the Gestapo meant certain death. But in the remote Balkans, a remarkable secret network was forming, one that would orchestrate the largest and most successful air rescue of World War II. It would come to be known as Operation Halyard. The mission's origins were as improbable as its outcome. When the first downed airmen parachuted into Yugoslavia in 1944, they were discovered not by the Germans, but by villagers loyal to General Draza Mihailovic and his Chetnik resistance fighters. These Serbians, though living under constant Axis threat, risked everything to hide the Americans in barns, mountain huts, and monasteries. "They treated us like brothers," one rescued pilot later said. "They gave us their food when they had nothing left themselves." Word of these stranded airmen reached the OSS headquarters in Bari, Italy. Colonel George Muselin, a rugged former football player turned OSS operative, was chosen to lead the rescue. His task: parachute into enemy-occupied Serbia, make contact with the Chetniks, and organize a clandestine airfield for extraction. It was a mission as bold as it was delicate. Yugoslavia was torn between rival resistance movements, and politics could be as deadly as gunfire. On August 2, 1944, Muselin and his team, including radio operator Arthur Jibilian and medical officer Captain Nick Lalick, parachuted near the village of Pranjani, west of Belgrade. The drop zone was lit only by a few lanterns and a full moon. Upon landing, they were greeted by hundreds of American airmen who had been in hiding for weeks. Emaciated, bearded, and dressed in peasant clothes, they had survived on bread and goat's milk supplied by local families. Against all odds, they had avoided capture in territory swarming with German patrols. Muselin quickly assessed the situation. The men were too many to move overland. Only an air extraction could save them. With Mihailovic's support, the villagers began clearing a plateau for an airstrip. Using oxen and wooden plows, they flattened a rough field over 700 meters long, camouflaging it with hay and branches. Every sound, every hammer strike, had to be muffled. Discovery by German reconnaissance aircraft would doom them all. By mid-August, the field, codenamed WWII Meadow, was ready. On the night of August 10th, under total radio silence, the first C-47 transport plane of the 60th Troop Carrier Group approached from southern Italy. Guided by makeshift oil lamps arranged in a T formation, the aircraft descended into the darkness. As the engines roared to a halt, the rescued men broke into tears. "It was like seeing angels land," one pilot recalled. Over the next several weeks, in a series of daring nighttime flights, OSS and U.S. Army Air Forces pilots extracted hundreds of downed airmen. Each mission required absolute precision: a quick landing, rapid loading, and immediate takeoff, all within 10 minutes. Local villagers lined the airfield, waving farewell as the planes lifted off into the night. Not a single plane was lost, and not one airman fell into enemy hands. By the end of the operation, 512 Allied airmen had been rescued. The success of Operation Halyard was astonishing, yet its secrecy was absolute. In a world already divided by wartime politics, Mihailovic's Chetniks had fallen out of favor with the Allies, who now supported Tito's communist partisans. The OSS was ordered to keep the operation classified to avoid diplomatic complications. Even the rescued men were instructed never to speak of where or how they had been saved. Colonel Muselin was later reprimanded for refusing to withhold credit from the Chetniks. "Those people saved our men," he said defiantly in his after-action report. "They deserve the honor." But history would not listen. For decades, the names of the Serbian villagers who risked everything remained buried in forgotten archives. Declassified documents decades later revealed the full scope of Halyard. Between August and December 1944, OSS teams conducted multiple extraction waves from makeshift airfields in Pranjani, coastal Jiva, and other villages. Each mission required immense coordination, with Allied pilots flying over 400 miles through enemy airspace. The sheer scale of precision, in a region crawling with Axis troops, defied belief. Captain Lalick later reflected, "It was the one mission that reminded us why we fought, not to destroy, but to save." In a war defined by brutality and loss, Operation Halyard was a rare triumph of humanity. No weapons, no assassinations, no sabotage, only courage, trust, and the unspoken bond between strangers. Today, the meadow at Pranjani remains a quiet place, marked by a small monument and a single bronze plaque honoring both Americans and Serbs. Few outside military history circles know the name Halyard, yet its legacy endures, a testament to the silent bravery of ordinary people who chose compassion over fear. But as Europe's battlefields quieted, the OSS faced a new kind of challenge, one not fought with guns or radios, but with negotiations in the shadows. In the dying days of the war, OSS officers entered secret talks with the enemy itself, a final covert operation that would shape the post-war world. It was called Operation Sunrise. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was crumbling. Soviet armies surged through the east, the Allies closed in from the west, and the cities of Europe lay in ruins. Yet, deep in the mountains of northern Italy, one of the war's final secrets was unfolding, a covert diplomatic dance that would hasten Germany's surrender in the south and plant the seeds of post-war mistrust. The mission was classified under a single, deceptively calm name: Operation Sunrise. The operation began not on a battlefield, but in the quiet corridors of Bern, Switzerland. It was here that Alan Dulles, head of the OSS Swiss station, orchestrated one of the most delicate negotiations of the entire war. His task, to open secret surrender talks with senior SS officers in Italy, including none other than SS General Karl Wolff, Himmler's chief of staff and the de facto commander of all German forces in northern Italy. If successful, the talks could bring an early end to the bloodshed in the region. If exposed, they could destroy the fragile Allied alliance with the Soviet Union. In February 1945, Dulles received word through an Italian intermediary, Baron Luigi Peri, that Wolff was willing to discuss terms of surrender. It was a shocking proposal. Wolff, one of Heinrich Himmler's most trusted men, was no stranger to atrocity. His hands were stained with the blood of deported Jews and partisans. Yet he now claimed to want peace. His motive was part self-preservation, part desperation. With the Reich collapsing, Wolff hoped to save both his command and his own life by surrendering to the Western Allies before the Soviets could reach Austria. Dulles faced an impossible dilemma. Officially, no Allied officer was authorized to negotiate with the enemy without Soviet participation. But the chance to spare thousands of lives and secure the surrender of up to 800,000 German troops was too great to ignore. Thus, in absolute secrecy, he began a series of clandestine meetings that would take place across neutral Switzerland, under the watchful eyes of spies from every side. The first meeting occurred on March 8, 1945, in the small Swiss village of Ascona. Wolff arrived disguised in civilian clothes, accompanied by SS Colonel Eugen Wenner and Italian negotiator Peri. The encounter was tense. Dulles, cautious and analytical, kept his tone formal. "If you truly seek surrender," he said, "you must prove it, not with words, but with actions." Wolff agreed to a ceasefire in selected sectors and promised to prevent the destruction of key infrastructure in northern Italy, bridges, railways, and the city of Milan itself. Back in Berlin, however, Himmler grew suspicious. The SS leader had heard whispers of his subordinates' dealings and ordered Wolff to Berlin. Fearing exposure and execution, Wolff delayed, claiming illness. As the talks continued, Soviet intelligence, always alert to Western maneuvers, intercepted fragments of the communications. Moscow exploded in fury. Stalin accused the Americans and British of negotiating behind the backs of the Allies, suggesting that the West sought a separate peace with Nazi Germany. The trust that had carried the Grand Alliance through the war began to fracture. Meanwhile, In Italy, the situation was deteriorating. The German 10th and 14th Armies were retreating north, pursued by Allied forces under General Mark Clark. Partisan uprisings flared in Milan, Turin, and Genoa, with civilians taking up arms against the remaining German garrisons. The front was collapsing faster than even Dulles had anticipated. On April 29, 1945, after weeks of coded telegrams and tense shuttle diplomacy, Wolfe finally agreed to unconditional surrender. The agreement was signed in Caserta, near Naples, by representatives of the German command and the Allied forces. 2 days later, at 2 a.m. on May 2nd, all German forces in Italy officially laid down their arms. More than 800,000 men surrendered without further bloodshed. The guns fell silent across the Po Valley, an entire front extinguished by negotiation rather than destruction. It was one of the few moments in the war when diplomacy triumphed over violence. But the victory was not without its shadow. Stalin's anger over Operation Sunrise hardened into suspicion that would soon fuel the Cold War. In a message to Roosevelt, he wrote bitterly, "Separate negotiations with the enemy can only be seen as an attempt to strike a deal behind the backs of the Allies." Though Dulles and his team had acted in good faith, the consequences of their secrecy rippled far beyond the mountains of Italy. For Dulles, the episode marked the beginning of a new era of espionage. Within months, the OSS would be dissolved, replaced by the Central Intelligence Agency, an organization shaped by the very man who had brokered peace in Bern. Wolfe, meanwhile, escaped the gallows, testifying in post-war trials, but serving only brief imprisonment. Many saw his survival as the final irony of a mission that blurred the line between morality and necessity. In later interviews, Dulles remained unapologetic. "We dealt with the men available," he said. "In war, purity is a luxury you cannot afford." His words echoed the uncomfortable truth of Operation Sunrise, that even peace can be born in the shadows. When the OSS packed its files and sealed its archives in late 1945, Sunrise was among the documents marked Top Secret, Eyes Only. Decades later, its papers revealed a portrait of a world shifting from open warfare to covert rivalry. The final OSS mission had ended one war and, unknowingly, laid the groundwork for the next. The story of the OSS, from the doomed commandos of La Spezia to the spies of Bern, is not one of glory, but of endurance. Their victories were measured not in medals or parades, but in moments of silence, a coded transmission sent, a life saved, a war shortened. In the words of General Donovan, written just before the OSS was dissolved, "The men who fought without uniforms have earned their place in history. They kept the secrets that bought us victory."